Before the ink of history could dry, before witnesses could even agree on what they had seen, an entire kingdom vanished, as if it had never drawn breath, and what I am about to tell you is the reason no map dares to name it. Welcome back to the Unveiled Scroll, a channel where we peel away the fragile layers of recorded history to reveal what was buried beneath silence, fear, and deliberate forgetting. And if you value stories that linger long after the screen goes dark, remember to like, subscribe, and share. Because tonight's chronicle is one many forces once fought desperately to erase. A tale known only in fragments as the Silent Citadel. In the late 12th century, when Europe trembled between faith and famine, there existed a fortified city-state perched on a basalt plateau somewhere between the Alps and the eastern marshes. A place travelers described with hesitation and monks recorded only in margins, for the citadel did not announce itself with banners or trade caravans, but with absence. 4 roads bent away from it. Birds altered their migration, and messengers sent toward its gates were known never to return or else to come back emptied of purpose, their eyes unfocused, their tongues unable to form the city's name. According to a handful of surviving ledgers, attributed to itinerant clerks, the Citadel ruled a small but prosperous kingdom, whose wealth did not come from conquest or commerce, but from knowledge and obsessive, disciplined accumulation of records, names, genealogies, verdicts, confessions, and unspoken thoughts, extracted through means never fully described. For the rulers believed that to catalog a thing completely was to own it, and to own memory itself was to own the future. At the heart of this belief stood Chancellor Allard Vane, a man educated in monasteries and courts alike, praised in his youth for restraint and clarity, yet privately convinced that humanity's greatest flaw was its talent for forgetting, and that chaos was born not of evil intent, but of lost remembrance. So he set out not as a tyrant in his own mind, but as a custodian of truth, determined to build a state that would remember everything forever. Under his guidance, the Silent Citadel rose, not merely in stone, but in ritual. Its archives, carved deep beneath the plateau chambers, stacked like catacombs of parchment where scribes worked by oil lamp day and night, transcribing testimonies of peasants and princes with equal reverence, recording dreams, heresies, doubts, and even the pauses between words. For Vane insisted that silence, too, was a form of speech. Those who entered the citadel felt it immediately, an oppressive stillness that pressed against the ears as if the city itself were listening, and visitors soon learned that casual speech was discouraged. Laughter unwelcome, and questions met with careful counter-questions designed not to answer but to extract, until many chose to leave quickly, to escape with only unease rather than interrogation. Yet the kingdom prospered. Famine bypassed its lands, crime dwindled to near nothing, and neighboring lords, impressed and unnerved, sent delegations to study its methods, returning home with praise on their lips but fear in their eyes, for they had glimpsed a society where privacy was considered a childish indulgence and confession a civic duty. The first cracks appeared quietly in the form of refugees who fled the citadel's reach, whispering of something called the Index of Final Names, a rumored ledger said to contain the true, complete identity of every living soul within the kingdom. Not merely their birth names, but the hidden selves they never spoke aloud, and according to these whispers, once a name was finalized in the index, that person ceased to change, their fate narrowing like a corridor with no doors. Chancellor Vane denied the index's existence publicly, dismissing such claims as superstition, but in private correspondence later recovered, he wrote that a society could not be stable if its people were allowed infinite reinvention, and that freedom without memory was merely another form of chaos. As years passed, emissaries from the kingdom stopped traveling altogether, trade routes dried, and the citadel's borders closed without declaration. While beyond its walls rumors grew darker, tales of citizens summoned to the archives and never seen again, not executed, not imprisoned, but somehow removed from communal awareness, as if their absence had been carefully edited into normalcy. Then came the winter of ash, when volcanic eruptions far to the south darkened skies across the continent, and famine threatened even the most prepared realms, yet reports claimed the Silent Citadel endured, untouched, its granaries, full, its people orderly and calm. And it was then that a coalition of neighboring powers resolved to intervene, driven by equal parts fear and hunger, for no kingdom, they argued, should survive disaster alone, unless it had stolen something from the natural order. Chroniclers described the coalition's army marching toward the plateau under gray skies, banners snapping in the cold wind, priests chanting for protection, and scouts sent ahead to return shaken, reporting that the citadel's gates stood open and unguarded. Yet the city beyond lay unnaturally quiet, with no smoke from chimneys, no footsteps on stone, no voices raised in alarm, only the echo of their own breathing as they advanced. What they found inside would fracture alliances, erase treaties, and force an agreement never written, a pact of silence sworn, not by ink but by terror, and it is here at the threshold of the silent citadel that the surviving records grow sparse, inconsistent, and contradictory, as if the act of observing what came next carried consequences beyond death, consequences that reached forward through time to shape the very history we think we know. This is only the beginning, and in the next part we will descend into the archives themselves, where memory was not preserved, but weaponized, and where the final act of Chancellor Allard Vane sealed not only his kingdom's fate, but the world's agreement to forget it ever existed. The soldiers stepped fully into the silent citadel, expecting ambush or resistance, yet what met them was a city frozen in the posture of obedience, doors unlocked, tables set for meals never eaten, quills resting in dried ink as if their owners had simply stood up and walked out of existence. And many later swore the silence was so dense it felt physical, pressing against the chest, slowing the heart, making every thought echo too loudly inside the skull. As the coalition advanced toward the central keep, they began to notice something more disturbing than abandonment, for names carved into door frames and shop signs had been meticulously chiseled away, leaving smooth scars in the stone, while statues in public squares bore no plaques, their faces weathered blank, as if identity itself had been peeled from the city with deliberate care. Chronicler Matthew of Rouen, whose account survives only in a single fragmented copy, wrote that it felt less like entering a conquered city, and more like trespassing inside a mind that had erased its own memories to protect itself. Beneath the citadel, the archives awaited, and when the sealed stairways were forced open, the soldiers descended into a labyrinth of shelves stretching farther than torchlight could reveal, stacked floor to ceiling with ledgers bound in dark leather, each labeled not by date or subject, but by a single symbol, resembling an eye crossed by a line, a mark no one present recognized, yet all felt instinctively warned them not to touch. Despite this, curiosity overcame caution, and the first ledger opened revealed a confession written in meticulous hand, recounting not crimes, but fleeting envies, doubts about faith, private moments of weakness, all recorded with unsettling intimacy, followed by a final annotation stamped in red wax that read complete. As more volumes were opened, a pattern emerged for each book, corresponded not to events, but to individuals' entire lives reduced to text ending, always with the same mark. And it was then that a terrible realization spread through the ranks, for these were not archives of the dead, but records of the living, and the completion did not signify death, but finality. Those whose ledgers were marked complete, the refugees had whispered, no longer changed, and here the meaning sharpened into horror, because to be finished was to be fixed forever, stripped of uncertainty, contradiction, and choice, preserved not as a person but as a conclusion. Deeper still lay the chamber known in later testimony as the Vault of Echoes, where scribes' desks were arranged in perfect circles around a central stone plinth, upon which rested a single colossal tome bound in pale material no one could confidently identify, warm to the touch, despite the cold air, and embossed with no title at all. This survivors believed was the index of final names, the culmination of Chancellor Vane's philosophy, for within it were not written confessions but distilled identities, each name inscribed only once, followed by a symbol indicating that nothing more could ever be added. According to a priest who later broke his oath of silence on his deathbed, the coalition leaders gathered around the index and understood immediately that destroying it was not an option, because to erase those names would not free the people recorded there but annihilate them completely. For the Citadel had bound existence itself to remembrance. At that moment, Allard Vane appeared not as a triumphant tyrant but as a weary custodian emerging from the shadows like a man who had already accepted his ending, and he spoke calmly, explaining that the Citadel had not been abandoned, only completed, for once every soul was fully known, fully recorded. There was nothing left for them to do but remain perfectly as they were, beyond suffering, beyond change, beyond history. He argued that the outside world, with its wars and forgetting, would only corrupt what he had preserved, and that the greatest mercy he could offer humanity was an example it would never dare to repeat. What happened next is described differently in every surviving account, yet all agree on one point, that a decision was made not to conquer the Citadel, but to erase it, not with fire or blade, but with silence. And so a pact was sworn beneath the plateau, binding kings, bishops, and generals alike, that the silent citadel would be struck from maps. Its name forbidden, its story fragmented and buried, because some knowledge, once known, demanded a price no nation was willing to pay. As the coalition withdrew, they sealed the archives behind stone and oath, leaving Vane and his perfected kingdom entombed within memory itself, neither alive nor dead, but suspended in the one state they could never escape. In the final part of this chronicle, we will follow the echoes of that pact forward through centuries, uncovering how traces of the silent Citadel still surface in censored manuscripts, vanished bloodlines, and the uneasy feeling that some histories are not lost by accident, but actively hiding from those who seek them. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, borders shifted like sand, yet the pact forged beneath the silent citadel endured with a persistence that defied reason, surfacing not as a written law, but as a shared instinct among those who handled history itself. Medieval maps from the following decades show a curious blank where a kingdom should have been, an expanse of unnamed land labeled only with warnings of impassable stone or unstable ground, and scribes who attempted to annotate. It often stopped mid-sentence, their manuscripts ending abruptly as if the thought itself had been forcibly abandoned. Genealogists later noted entire bloodlines that simply terminated in the late 12th century, not through plague or war, but through absence. Heirs, unrecorded marriages, unacknowledged, as though families had been edited out of existence, leaving behind gaps that no official explanation could fill. In monasteries across Europe, marginal notes appeared beside otherwise orthodox texts, strange symbols, resembling an eye crossed by a line scratched hurriedly and then scraped away, while a handful of forbidden codices spoke obliquely of a city that chose remembrance over mercy, and paid for it with annihilation by consensus. Scholars who pursued these threads too openly often recanted suddenly, changing their focus, abandoning years of work, or retreating into silence, later claiming with genuine confusion that they could no longer recall what had once driven their obsession. The most unsettling evidence, however, lies not in documents, but in behavior, for throughout history regimes that attempted total surveillance absolute record keeping or the eradication of private thought were met with resistance far fiercer than practical necessity demanded, as if humanity carried a buried inherited memory of where such ambitions led. Psychologists studying collective fear have pointed out a recurring anxiety tied to being fully known, fully categorized, fully defined, a dread that goes beyond the loss of freedom and touches something more existential, the terror of becoming complete too soon. Some believe this is the true legacy of the silent citadel, not a story remembered, but a warning embedded deep within cultural instinct, shaping laws, ethics, and taboos long after the facts were erased. As for Chancellor Lord Vane, no grave bears his name, no portrait survives, yet in rare, censored correspondences referred to not as a monster but as a mirror, reflecting a temptation humanity has never fully escaped: the desire to fix the world, to end uncertainty, to trade becoming for being. And perhaps that is why the pact still holds, why no nation has ever openly claimed the plateau where the citadel once stood, why expeditions sent their report to nothing but unremarkable stone and an inexplicable urge to leave quickly and never return. The silent citadel does not haunt us as a ghost, but as an absence, a reminder that history is not only written by victors but pruned by survivors, and that sometimes the most important stories are not those we tell, but those we agree together never to speak aloud again. Thank you for traveling with me through this veiled chapter of the past here on the Unveiled Scroll. And if this story stirred something uneasy yet familiar within you, explore the other chronicles on this channel where forgotten histories still wait patiently in the dark, hoping, perhaps, to remain undiscovered.